Okay, so hi everyone. Our group is going to be talking about globalization's effect on farming in developing countries specifically. So I'm going to start us off by talking about globalization in Mexico and how that's affected the farming sector there. I thought it would be important to kind of look at some of the history of globalization and trade openness in Mexico. So from about 1950 to the 1970s, Mexico followed something called import substitution industrialization, and kind of a combination of the Great Depression and World War II forced autarky and self-sufficiency on Mexico, and that's kind of why they started doing this. So what ISI is a trade and economic policy that advocates replacing foreign imports with domestic production. So kind of tariffs were implemented in an effort to help infant domestic industries. Some other things they did were nationalize a lot of industries and provide subsidies. So the purpose of this was kind of just overall, they wanted to industrialize Mexico and they wanted to be able to be self-sufficient and not rely on other countries. So initially, ISI did provide unprecedented growth for Mexico. I know up until 1982, they only experienced positive GDP growth. However, this was unsustainable in the long run. So because they're just producing within their own country and kind of not having those exports, there's definitely a lack of competition, which prevented them from, having that incentive to be innovative and efficient and things like that. And also because there was such a small market by just producing for Mexico, there's definitely a limited opportunity for growth in the long run. So all these factors kind of combine to influence Mexico to begin opening up its economy in the mid-1980s. So this is just a graph that I kind of thought helped show Mexico's GDP growth and how in the beginning ISI was super beneficial. As you can see, like in this area, they only experienced this great positive growth above 2%. But then in the 1980s, it kind of dropped, and that's what kind of influenced them to start opening up their economy. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about is NAFTA, which is the North American Free Trade Agreement, and that was signed and implemented in 1994. And it was signed between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. And it was kind of just an attempt to make trade easier and freer among the countries. So when it comes to agriculture, the agreement required Mexico to completely open up their agriculture market over the span of 15 years. And at the same time, there was an elimination of the ejido system, which is communal land that was provided in some communities in Mexico. So the community members were able to farm and had a place to grow their own food if they needed, but that was eliminated around this time, and that land was open for privatization, which was obviously detrimental to any peasants or farmers that relied on that land to grow their food. And furthermore, the agreement required a decrease in subsidies and an elimination of minimum prices for crops, which was obviously very detrimental to many farmers who were either relying on the subsidies or getting enough money for their crops that they were growing. So essentially, the agreement, because it opened up trade between the countries, a lot of rural Mexican farmers now had to compete with large industrial farms and their low prices. So because these farms were so big, and because a lot of times farmers in the United States receive really large subsidies, they're able to sell their crops at much lower prices than people in Mexico might be able to. So as a result of that, 2 million Mexican farmers lost their land because of the trade agreement. And then lastly, because of, first, obviously the proximity to the United States, along with NAFTA, this led the United States to be the main destination for exports. And this created a problem because it created such a dependence on the US and their market. there's just this unpredictability and volatility when you're just relying on one country, which can obviously cause problems for a lot of people in Mexico if, something happens in the United States, or if the prices in the United States drop dramatically because of something. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to talk about is the loss of indigenous farming methods that has occurred as a result of globalization. So for centuries, farmers in Mexico have used something called milpa as their farming method. And this includes things like swidden, which is like slash and burn agriculture, fallow, which involves leaving the land to rest for a few years or however long the farmer determines to help nutrients return to the soil. And it also includes crop rotations and planting, a diversity of different crops. And this has been around for centuries. The Mayans used it, so it definitely has a rich history. And really important to understand milpa, I think, is to know that it's not just an agriculture system. It also has really significant cultural implications as well for many of the indigenous people and just rural farmers in Mexico. So despite its clear importance, there's definitely been a shift towards more permanent, intensive agriculture. And this is kind of sad because there's so many pros to milpa. So some of them are that there's a much more reliable harvest because the farmers are planting multiple different kinds of crops. So it's much more sustainable for, different kinds of environments or weather that may happen during one harvest year. There's also low monetary investment. You don't have to have a lot of capital or invest in big machines, which makes it much easier for, smaller farmers to use this farming method. Because of such low investment, you're also able to maximize your returns when you use milpa. And then lastly, which I think is really important, is there's a huge environmental benefit to using milpa. It definitely helps increase biodiversity and things like that, and make sure the soil doesn't, lose its nutrients, things like that. So there's definitely a lot of pros to it. So just continuing to talk about kind of why this method has been decreasing. So globalization has led to the significant reduction in government support for farmers, especially small-scale one. Like we talked about earlier, there's no subsidies. The ejido system is no longer in place. So it's much harder for milpa and these small farmers to be profitable. And there's just overall a decrease in agriculture activities, especially in rural Mexico, where this farming method is most popular. And then furthermore, in their attempt to counteract some of the negatives of agricultural liberalization, the Mexico government did begin to implement some new subsidy programs, but there were a few issues with these. So to receive the money, the farmers needed to maintain the same plot of land under the same crop. And this is essentially the opposite of what milpa is, because milpa really advocates for crop rotation and high biodiversity. So it was impossible for farmers to receive this money if they're using this old indigenous farming method. So important to note is that milpa hasn't completely disappeared. It's just significantly decreased. And when people are continuing to use it, they often combine it with other cultivation methods. Also, a lot of family members are now receiving money like through other means, like maybe they're going to work in stores, or a lot of them are receiving remittances, things like that. So it's still prevalent, just not to the extent that it used to be. Okay, and then lastly, I want to talk about monocropping, which I thought went really well after the loss of indigenous land, because that's kind of, they go hand in hand. So this all started during the Green Revolution, and that had a large impact on the crop diversity in Mexico. So the main point of the Green Revolution was really to increase production of farming, and because of this, monocropping became more popular. So the standardization that occurs through monocropping just makes it easier to produce on large scales, because you can use, the same pesticides and herbicides. You need, one kind of machinery instead of different. You need one kind of like environmental conditions when it comes to water and nutrients. And because it's such on a large scale, you definitely need less labor and it's much more capital intensive. So that's why monocropping kind of became more popular. Given NAFTA and other trade agreements that liberalized agriculture, monocropping just became much more profitable when competing with foreign imports. So there's evidence that supports that specialization in the fruit and vegetable sector. So, growing one specific kind of fruit or vegetable like papaya is a direct result of the demands of the international market. So, how much food they're demanding, the price that they're demanding, monocropping just became the easiest way to do it. So despite that monocropping might be, beneficial and profitable in the short run, it definitely leads to exploitation of the land and is definitely harmful to the environment. So it erodes and compacts the soil, and it makes the spread of plant diseases easier because it's the same plants next to each other. And it depletes the soil of nutrients, and it sometimes makes the land completely unviable, and these big farms will have to, leave and find new land to plant on, leaving this plot for the community that's completely unusable. So there's definitely a significant amount of negatives to monocropping, especially when it affects these small rural indigenous farmers. Okay, so I kind of just wanted to end with the overall impact of globalization on farming in Mexico. So the biggest thing that I kind of noticed was that there's this shift from a holistic, cultural, and ecological practice when you come to understanding farming to one that is solely concerned with profit maximizing. So kind of in the past when I was doing my readings, it was easy to notice that farming was more about, being self-sufficient, growing this food to sustain and feed your family and your community. And it was this practice that you did as a family. Whereas now it's more okay, how can we make this money? And how can we just profit as much as we can? And you can see that with the increase in large farmers and monocropping, especially when it comes to monocropping. We see it's so detrimental, but people still do it because of the profits you can receive from it. So although globalization in Mexico has some positive impacts, don't want to just gloss over that. I think for the most part, people have been harmed. So there have been industrial workers and a few in the north that we can see some experience wage increases. However, it's definitely clear that agricultural workers are especially vulnerable. Definitely been losing a lot of their land and things because they just can't compete with the prices. And furthermore, globalization has impacted, all of Mexico and all people living there because there's been a price increase in a lot of the foods and staples that they own, and it's much harder for them to afford. So I know since the signing of NAFTA, there's been about a 428% increase in staple food prices, which is significantly higher than the increase in minimum wage and the inflation. So it's definitely had a huge negative impact on, all of Mexicans, not just farmers. So yeah, that's what I found to be the biggest impacts of globalization on farming in Mexico.
Okay. So I'm going to be talking about agriculture and globalization in the Philippines. So just a little background on agriculture in the Philippines. It's obviously a very important sector, if not the most important sector in terms of employment. As you can see, nearly 1/3 of the population is a part of the agricultural labor force. And despite the fact that it is such a large sector, agriculture only contributes to about 12% of the nation's GDP. And it's for this reason that the country is attempting to move away from agriculture to more manufacturing jobs, which I'll be discussing more later on. And then additionally, one of the most important staple crops in the Philippines is rice. This is mostly because the Philippines is a large producer of rice, one of the largest in the world, and also because it's the base of the diet in the Philippines. However, the production rate has not kept up with population growth in the country, so there's food insecurity problems. And that's also the reason that the Philippines actually has some of the highest rates of rice importations as well. So the Philippines has been heavily impacted by globalization. I decided to focus on one paper, and it was a case study conducted in a village that the researchers called East Laguna Village, which you can see right here on the map. And the researcher explored 4 different globalization forces and their effect on the village from 1966 to 1995. And just for some context, the 4 different factors that I'm going to be talking about will be discussed in chronological order. And so the 4 forces are population growth, the Green Revolution, land reform programs, and non-farming activities. So I'm just going to go over like what each of these means, how it relates to globalization, and how it impacted the Philippines, and specifically East Laguna Village. So beginning with population growth, as I discussed earlier, this has been very impactful, especially when it comes to food security. And the population has grown very rapidly in the Philippines, and this is largely attributed to globalization. And it has mostly been a result of the importation of more advanced medical and public health technologies, which obviously leads to individuals leading longer lives. And while this is very positive, the study found that the biggest impact of this population growth, other than food insecurity, was that it reduced the amount of land available, which then led to class division between landowners and non-landowners and increased poverty within the village. So since the 1930s, the population growth began, and then in the years that the researchers looked at this village from 1966 to 1995, the number of villagers actually tripled. So very rapid population growth. So despite this negative impact of globalization, the Green Revolution was supposed to work to counteract the problems created by land scarcity. So as Lily discussed earlier, the Green Revolution was a global effort between the 1950s and 1960s to increase agricultural production by exchanging technology. So in the Philippines, this mostly meant improving their irrigation systems and using more high cultivating or high yielding rice varieties. And this did lead to increased yield in the Philippines, but also caused the yield around the world with other major rice producers to also increase, which then caused rice prices to drop significantly. Interestingly enough, although income decreased for all those working in agriculture, because as I discussed earlier, rice is so heavily consumed in the country, this effect was not super detrimental to laborers. Because people in the Philippines spend most of their income on food. It was cheaper to buy food. So basically the impact of the Green Revolution sort of evened out. However, it was obviously not very beneficial to large farmers and landlords. And one way which the revolution was expected to see improvements in the village was by increasing employment. But the new technologies made labor less necessary in a lot of circumstances. So from 1966 to 1995, labor use decreased 40%, but then hired labor actually increased by 40%. So overall, the Green Revolution didn't really have that much of an impact on the village. Okay. So land reform programs were not necessarily a force of globalization in itself, but rather they were created to help reduce disparities in land ownership that population growth had and the Green Revolution had created. So the policies are kind of complex. So just to sort of summarize, the village shifted from sharecropping tenancy, which is where farmers would basically rent land from large landlords, to leasehold tenancy, which basically gave tenants temporary ownership of land. And at the beginning, the land reforms helped reduce income inequality between the tenants and landlords, but it created more inequality between tenant farmers and farmers without land. This then led to inequality in education in the village, with laborers having spent less years in school. So I have a graph on the next page, which sort of helps explain this. So as you can see, in 1966, when the program was created, landlords, which constitute the smallest number of all agricultural workers, had the greatest share of income, so it was very unequal. And by the 80s, this gap is narrowed between landowners and farmers. However, you can see that the income of hired labor barely increases. So there was just a greater inequality between these two groups of people now. And then you can see too, here's the change in education levels, which I thought was really interesting just to see the dramatic change in education. Okay, so despite some of these inequalities created from market liberalization, non-farm employment opportunities increased heavily due to globalization, mostly in the 1970s and the 1980s. Mostly globalization introduced in industrial areas with many modern factories, and transportation was improved, which made it easier for people living in the rural areas to get manufacturing jobs in urban areas. And then many or most of the factories were funded through foreign direct investment, mostly because labor was very cheap there. So it was obviously beneficial for other countries to invest into these sort of manufacturing jobs in this country. And so the biggest effect of this new development was that agricultural laborers, which, as I had just shown, had been shut out of economic opportunities, were now able to find employment in areas, mostly in construction and transportation. There's also the creation of many small manufacturers as well, which was like outside of urban areas, which made it even easier for these agricultural laborers to get to. And they would produce things such as clothes and toys, and also they were very large producers of Christmas ornaments, which I thought was really interesting. So yeah, that's the effect of non-farming activities. So I'll discuss more of this impact, and then the impact of globalization overall. So in order to determine the net result of these 4 factors of globalization, the researchers examined the incomes of all households in East Laguna Village. So I have a graph on the next page which sort of shows this, but I'll just explain it now. So agricultural laborers had a pretty slow growth of income, but the results of their study did show that the income growth was positive across all positions in the village for the years they examined. The researchers also wanted to look at if the distribution of income changed over these years. So they looked at the Gini coefficient, which increased slightly by 1996. However, the incidence of poverty decreased from 68% to 56%. So here you see the change in income. So it's positive across all positions. You can see here how it's a lot slower growth for agricultural laborers. However, as I discussed earlier, a lot of agricultural laborers went to non-farm work. So that income increased a lot over that time period. So the growth wasn't as slow as it seems from this graph. And then there's this graph which shows like the Gini coefficient and incidence of poverty. It's not like the best graph, but if you look down here, you can see The Gini coefficient didn't change between 1974 and 1983, and then went up to 51% by 1995, which obviously isn't necessarily a positive change, but it's not super significant. But the incidence of poverty decreased from 68 to 56%, which obviously 56% poverty rate is not very good, but it's a lot better than it was in 1974. So just to summarize everything, the population growth was a major factor that led to rising inequality in the Philippines. Land reform programs really only increased inequality in East Laguna Village, and the Green Revolution was pretty marginal in having an impact on the village. But the presence of non-farming industries had a significant impact on increasing income levels and reducing poverty. So the author suggests that the presence of poverty would have been significantly higher if the East Laguna Village had not worked to open their economy after they experienced such rapid population growth. So in other words, the authors believe that while globalization had negative impacts on the village, the liberalization of markets had an overall positive impact on the village. So that's all I have to say about that. Oh man.
You're good, Gil.
Hey everyone, here we'll be looking into a more comparative study of effects of globalization on agricultural sectors in a partially developed nation, the Ukraine. Located in between Western Europe and Russia, with some of the world's most fertile black soil, gives Ukraine a lot of potential to enter the world market in agricultural trade. However, following the transition from an economy based on the Soviet central planning to price liberalization, would create a disparity of prices of production due to a lack of horizontal coordination between domestic industries to efficiently make production profitable. In the late 1990s, farmland that was taken away from Ukrainian families during the Stalin regime was redistributed among small farms, creating a huge transition from collective farming into smaller privately owned farms, with the majority of the state's farmland belonging to a small privately owned farm would lead to a decline in the economy because of a lack of state funding for subsidies and inefficiency in farming techniques. These farms are also run on low levels of mechanization and outdated or non-existing infrastructure necessary to produce production and lower incentives for investing. And finally, in 2014, the Ukraine found itself in a severe economic and political crisis, deciding to change their political route to integrate to the European Union of Western Europe, or maintain a close alliance with Russia in their trade. This divide in the country was divided the country by Western Ukraine and Eastern Ukraine, where Western Ukrainians typically wanted to join the EU, while Eastern Ukrainians, who majority of us also would speak Russian, wanted to maintain close ties with Russia, and even organize pro-Russian militias such as in Donetsk, and even the presence of Russian military in Crimea. This uncertainty at this time caused Ukrainian interest rates to become very high and volatile. And these high interest rates, along with a lack of credit history, would slow the growth of bank lending, which is a crucial aspect for increasing exports. All right, as I mentioned earlier, the 1999 land reform redistributed 70% of land to be physically owned by rural individuals. However, in 2001, a moratorium was passed that prohibited landowners from selling their land. There have been many drawbacks to this ban. Large price gaps of land highlight the fragmentation of agricultural land, lessens the bargaining power of individual plot holders, and favors large and sometimes politically connected agricultural businesses. Here you can see lots of examples of corruption in the Ukrainian government. Land valuation is also a very difficult price to measure in the absence of an explicit land market. And since businesses rely on land leases to access land, large enterprises have to contract with numerous landowners that create high transaction costs for very short leases, usually year to year. Finally, limited access to finance slows the development of agricultural land, as collateralizing land is pretty much impossible. And according to land code policies, foreign entities are unable by law to own agricultural land, and this essentially just discourages investment as to the purchase of or building of a factory that creates a right to own land and not the other way around. So foreign companies were not able to own land for agricultural reasons, but there are some exceptions with building factories that were not directly related to agriculture. All right, protecting soil from erosion and the water supply from pollution is important in maintaining a healthy environment for agricultural and protecting the general welfare of Ukrainians, especially after the Chernobyl meltdown in 1986, where 1.1 million hectares of agricultural land is still contaminated by this radioactive element. Also, 60% of agricultural land was eroded as of 2016 due to Ukraine's relief and climate and its very high proportion of arable land, which is essentially just land that can be plowable. So Ohio has a lot of arable land as well. And this would make erosion a widespread natural phenomenon. Poor land management practices such as crop cultivation on steep slopes, excessive cutting of forests, shrubs and bushes, and overgrazing accelerated erosion as well. Short leases causes inconsistency and land management between tenants, and usually these land leases would be very, very short, from like year to year. So there would be a lot of inconsistency in how they would manage land. And also undefined land ownership has also contributed to land erosion by leading to illegal cutting of tree belts that served as windbreaks around farmland. In turn, erosion leads to a loss of soil fertility and pollution and sedimentation in rivers, lakes, waters, and water reservoirs, excuse me. All right, monopolistic industries such as the railroad company, I'm not going to try to pronounce the name or I would severely butcher it up, but it is an impediment to the expansion of agricultural trade, because low state budgets are allocated towards these industries, leaving railroads unable to build new tracks or to increase the number of grain carts. And high transportation fees with low levels of infrastructure makes transportation production more expensive and leaving farmers with a smaller share of a project from the world market. And finally, private companies do not invest into creating their own fleet due to low levels of functional infrastructure in the state. All right, and here it is important for there to be a horizontal cooperation between the different domestic sectors. And this is basically just a specialization of several different sectors to improve production and efficiency of exports. And this was encouraged by the European Union, which is the group Ukraine decided to join in 2014 following violent protests in Kiev. And so now I just want to talk about the integration into the EU and how beneficial this was in essentially modernizing Ukraine. Here, increased environmental standards was introduction of agrarian techniques used in OECD countries. And this allowed having a positive impact on employment growth in rural regions. There were more opportunities for cooperation and to exchange knowledge with experience and technologies. Modernizing infrastructure and technology allowed the faster and more efficient production of agricultural products for export. And standards that were previously not required for exports of Russian goods, such as receiving licenses to promote health and safety protections as a non-tariff ban, were now required by the EU. And so with that, the improvement of agrarian policy and finally allowing significantly more funding from the state budget, as well as more funding from OECD countries in the EU and the United States. And and just like basically to sum this up real fast, in a partially developed nation such as Ukraine, the integration of a free trade agreement with investment opportunities and with being partially industrialized already gave it a more advantage rather than some of the other developing nations. And that's it. All right.
Okay, so moving on to India, liberalization began in 1991, and the effects of liberalization have been drastic, with a farmer suicide epidemic beginning 4 years later in 1995, in which an average of 34 farmers commit suicide every day, and that continues to this day. This is due to a number of different factors that we will explain relating to both the natural environment and the economic situation for farmers and farm laborers. The damage done on both ends feeds into each other, as we will see, and it creates a cycle of poverty that is extremely difficult to escape from. India is the world's second largest producer of both wheat and rice, and in order to create this advantage in the agriculture sector, Indian farmers use monocropping similarly to the other farmers from the countries we examined previously. Farmers monocrop different crops in different regions depending on the local market, on land availability, and on the local climate. For example, the crop most heavily grown in the Jalgaon district is cotton, with there being no other intermittent crops grown in any significant amount. Growing only one crop does help farmers to stay competitive, but this also leaves them vulnerable to financial ruin in the case of low harvest, drought, or loss of land due to a land dispute, which is a very common occurrence in many regions of India. Not only that, but there are many farmers in India that are small scale, in fact most are, meaning that it is difficult for them to produce at a competitive level even if they do monocrop. This leads farmers to use GMO seeds, which are faster growing and pest resistant. However, there are still both natural and economic issues related to GMO seeds as well. On the environmental side, GMO seeds are only pest resistant for a few years, at which time the lack of crop diversity makes it easier for pests to mutate and develop a tolerance to the pesticide in the crops. This means that every few years, farmers lose a harvest or several harvests to pests and then have to discard their entire store of seeds and buy entirely new seeds from either DuPont, Syngenta, Dow, or Bayer, which is the company that was previously known as Monsanto. This leads into the economic issues, which is the fact that 4 companies have the market cornered on GMO seeds. This is possible because GMO seeds are patented, so farmers have to buy their seeds from whatever company has engineered them the fastest that year, basically. Farmers have to pay whatever price the companies set their seeds at, and they have to buy an entirely new stock of seeds all over again every few seasons due to the pest mutations. There are actually studies that have been done that show a direct link between the natural environmental issues we just talked about and the farmer suicide epidemic. The study that I included here is from the University of California, Berkeley, and it shows that an increase of just 1 Celsius on any given day during the growing season was associated with 67 more suicides, and that a more drastic increase of 5 Celsius on any given day was associated with 335 more suicides. The study also showed that only temperature and weather changes occurring during the growing season had any effect on the suicide rate, which shows the direct link between the suicide rate and the environmental issues that India is going through. The study also showed that rainfall increases of as little as 1 centimeter per year were associated with the average 7% drop in the suicide rate, which shows the desperation in the situation of these farmers, in that even an increase as little as 1 centimeter per year could prevent them from committing suicide because it would improve their harvest enough. Okay, so not only are there all of these natural resource issues that Indian farmers have to deal with, but there's also a ton of damage that they take from the economic side of globalization. So basically, going back into history a little bit, around the 70s, in a district called Andhra Pradesh, there was these self-help organizations that started in order to help poor women in the area, and these organizations introduced an idea of microloans, which are basically like very, very small, like one-time loans that people take out at very high interest rates in order to be able to pay off small costs like house repairs or the buying of land, well, not the buying of land, but the buying of like livestock, small costs like this in order to help them take a step out of the hole of poverty. However, these microloans have very untenable terms for the poor people that take them out. First of all, as I said before, they have very high interest rates, usually averaging around 24 to 30%. And the people who credit these microloans basically specifically advertise to women and poor people in various regions of India who have small incomes who would not be able to pay back these high interest rates. The creditors of these microloans also engage in multiple lending, which means that they will go to somebody who has taken out a loan or multiple loans and then basically coerce them into taking out another loan on top of that to pay back those old ones, basically keeping these people in a cycle of poverty and debt. The repayment agents for these microloans will actually come to people's villages and straight up to their houses and be very persistent and coercive about giving people an ultimatum. You either take out another loan to pay back your old loans, or you pay us back right away, or that's it. That's basically the only options that these people have. And so a lot of women, poor people, farmers in general in India are faced with these ultimatums and commit suicide in order to keep their family out of debt and to take this debt off of their family's head. And so these farmers not only have to deal with droughts, weather events, soil degradation, the loss of harvest due to any of these other reasons. They not only have to deal with the extreme cost of having to rebuy their stock of GMO seeds every couple seasons, but they also have to deal with the effect of these microloans that are in fact now financed by like the World Bank. These are the effects of globalization and the liberalization of the market on Indian farmers. So obviously, when you have all of these different issues facing a huge percentage of India's population, local and federal politicians are going to start taking notice. So there is a phenomenon of local politicians lending small amounts of money to farmers who have taken out microloans, basically in order to secure their votes for the next election. And both sides of the political spectrum in India, the Congress and the BJP party, which is the party of the Prime Minister Narendra Modi, have introduced their own political solutions to the farmer suicide crisis. The Congress has introduced a potential policy of a universal basic income for the poor, not specifically for farmers, but it is targeted towards farmers as well, as farmers are such a huge population of the poor people in India. And the incumbent BJP party has a policy of loan waivers for people who apply for them. However, there are a lot of farmers as well as experts in India who say that neither one of these policies actually gets to the root of the problem adequately. Because the universal basic income introduced by the Congress doesn't come close to the expenses that farmers have to pay in order to survive, paying for land, paying for supplies and seeds, and paying for farm workers on a daily basis. And then experts also say that the loan waivers are just a band-aid for the problem and don't actually get to the root of the exploitation and the issues that Indian farmers face. Earlier this year, the BJP party released a liberalization bill of their farming policy that basically opened up the market to bigger international corporations, and farmers in India have protested this by blocking train tracks, blocking roads, as well as burning effigies of local politicians, because they say that this could continue to choke out small-scale farmers even further by interfering with the minimum set price for the produce that they sell. And so basically, no satisfactory policy has been introduced by any political party. And so farmers continue to protest basically on a daily basis. And they will continue to do so ostensibly until an actual solution to the problems introduced by globalization is given by one of the parties. So in conclusion, you could see that globalization has affected each one of these countries differently, depending on the physical, geographical, and the historical context that the country is in. However, there are some common issues that each of our countries has had to deal with, including crop specialization, a lack of available and or arable land, as well as economic issues stemming from the liberalization of the market that these farmers have to deal with. So the solution for each one of these countries will probably be different depending on each of their contexts. Each one of us in the group has our own ideas about what the proper solutions would be, but at least now we have a better idea of the problems stemming from globalization.